The family vanished in 1975, and for 45 years, nobody knew where they went. The house stood still, frozen in time. Dinner plates sat on the table, half empty. The radio hummed softly in the kitchen, tuned to a station that no longer existed. Out back, the dog whined at the door, nails scratching at the wood until they bled. And inside, silence. That silence would last decades. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. The neighborhood was the kind of place you'd drive through and forget. A small cul-de-sac lined with maple trees, kids' bikes left on lawns, and the smell of charcoal grills on summer nights. It was a pocket of America that seemed immune to chaos, or at least, that's what the families who lived there wanted to believe. The Johnsons, Robert, his wife Margaret, their 12-year-old daughter Emily, and 9-year-old son Tommy, were right in the middle of it all. Their home was modest, a pale yellow two-story with white trim, a swing set out back, and flower boxes that Margaret tended to every spring. Robert worked as a mechanic at a local garage, his hands always stained with oil, while Margaret picked up part-time shifts at the library. Her days spent between shelves of books and the hum of quiet air conditioning. If you ask anyone who lived nearby, they'll tell you the same thing. The Johnsons were normal, too normal maybe, the kind of family people described as nice folks but didn't think much about after. And maybe that's why their disappearance hit so hard, because if the Johnsons, the friendly, ordinary Johnsons, could just vanish into thin air, then maybe no one was safe. It was a Thursday night, early autumn, when everything seemed to stop. The trees outside were beginning to turn, their leaves painting the streets with reds and oranges. The air carried that crisp bite, the kind that hinted winter wasn't too far behind. Emily had been at choir practice earlier in the evening. Tommy had played a little league game. Margaret prepared a simple dinner: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of comfort food she was known for. Robert came home late, smelling of gasoline and motor oil, dropping his lunchbox on the counter like he always did. Nothing about that night should have been remarkable, and yet, it would become the most significant night in the town's history. The first sign something was wrong came the next morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, noticed the Johnsons' car still in the driveway. Robert usually left for the garage by 7 sharp. He was predictable like that his old blue Chevy pulling out every morning, a familiar sound on the street. But by 8, the car hadn't moved. By 9, she noticed something stranger, the dog, barking and whining behind the back door. She assumed maybe Margaret was just running late, maybe the kids were homesick. But when afternoon came and the shades remained drawn, Mrs. Cartwright began to worry. That evening, another neighbor knocked on their door. No answer. He peeked through the front window and froze. Dinner was still on the table, plates with food that hadn't been cleared, glasses half full of milk. The television was on in the living room, a faint static glow flickering against the walls. But no one was inside. The Johnsons were gone. When police arrived later that night, they found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, nothing missing, at least nothing obvious. Clothes hung neatly in closets. Shoes lined up by the door. Emily's homework sat on the kitchen counter, her pencil resting mid-sentence as if she'd been interrupted. And the strangest detail? All the beds were untouched, blankets pulled tight, pillows still fluffed. It was as if no one had gone to sleep that night. Theories bloomed instantly. Maybe they had gone on a spontaneous trip. Maybe there was a family emergency out of town. But Margaret's purse was still in the kitchen. Robert's wallet and keys sat on the counter. Even the kids' jackets hung by the door. No one leaves like that, not on purpose. The Johnsons' disappearance spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People whispered on porches, children listened wide-eyed to rumors at school. Parents double-locked doors and checked on their kids twice at night, because the idea that a family could simply evaporate was too terrifying to comprehend. Some neighbors claimed they heard strange noises the night before, a low thud, a car engine idling too long, muffled voices. Others swore they saw a figure near the house after midnight, though no one could agree on what he looked like. But the fact remained, the Johnsons were gone. Their home was a shell, stuck in that last night. And for years, the town would replay those final hours like a broken record, trying to find an explanation. Looking back now, it's chilling to think about the ordinary details, the ones investigators photographed and cataloged but never understood. The dog, left without food or water, pacing the backyard. The milk on the table, souring in the late autumn air. Emily's school bag, slung over a chair, with a birthday card for her friend tucked inside. A card that would never be delivered. These weren't the remnants of people who planned to leave. These were the shadows of lives interrupted. Decades later, when the truth finally surfaced, neighbors would revisit that night in their minds. They'd remember the quiet, the way the street felt heavy, the way something seemed off but no one could name it. Because deep beneath their feet, only a few houses away, the answer had been there all along. That's where we'll leave the opening. But the story doesn't stop here. This is just the first step into the abyss the night a family vanished and an entire community fell into fear. The Johnsons' story was only beginning. Before the Johnsons became a headline, before they were reduced to a police report and a stack of missing posters, they were just people, a family. The kind you passed in the grocery store without a second thought, the kind that blended into the rhythm of a neighborhood. And maybe that's why their story hits so hard, because they weren't strangers, they were familiar. Robert Johnson was the kind of man who seemed carved from the era itself. Broad-shouldered, hair always slicked back with just a hint of grease from the garage, a pack of cigarettes tucked in the pocket of his work shirt. He was quiet but steady, the kind of guy who fixed a neighbor's flat tire without charging a dime, who lent his lawnmower even when he needed it himself. He worked long hours at Harlan's Garage, a squat brick building on the edge of town where the scent of motor oil clung to the air like fog. People trusted Robert. He was the one who'd give you a straight answer, not the kind of mechanic who'd try to upsell you on parts you didn't need. Honest Bob, some of the regulars called him. His coworkers remembered his laugh, low and gravelly, the kind that rumbled more than it rang. They remembered how he always carried a thermos of black coffee, how he could name the make and model of a car by the sound of its engine. Margaret, his wife, was softer in every way. Where Robert was quiet, Margaret was chatty, not in a nosy way, but in the way that made you feel seen, like you mattered. She worked part-time at the town library, the old stone building that smelled of dust and ink, where the floorboards creaked under every step. Kids adored her. She had a way of recommending books that stuck, placing a copy of Charlotte's Web or Island of the Blue Dolphins in their hands with a conspiratorial smile. She was the kind of woman who baked extra cookies for the school bake sale, who remembered birthdays, who clipped coupons with almost obsessive precision. Neighbors recall how she hummed while tending to her flower boxes, a habit so constant that some swore they could tell the time of day by the sound of Margaret's humming drifting across the street. Then there were the kids. Emily was 12, at that in-between age where childhood still clung to her but the shadows of adolescence were creeping in. She loved to sing, her choir director at church said. Her voice had this clear, bell-like quality. She was also a writer, scribbling poems in the margins of her school notebooks, poems she rarely showed anyone but her best friend, Sarah. She had braces, the kind with the tiny colored bands that she'd beg her mom to let her match to the seasons, orange and black for Halloween, red and green for Christmas. In photographs, she's always squinting, her smile wide but a little shy, as though she wasn't sure she deserved to take up space. Tommy, the youngest at 9, was pure energy, the kind of kid who scraped his knees so often that Band-Aids were practically part of his wardrobe. He loved baseball. He wasn't particularly good at it, but that didn't stop him from showing up with his bat slung over his shoulder, cheeks flushed from running the bases. Neighbors remembered his laugh, loud and unrestrained, the kind that made other kids laugh just because it was contagious. He had a cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much water Margaret smoothed over it in the mornings. Tommy was the one who'd knock on doors asking if someone could come out to play, the kind of child who made friends instantly, who seemed to breathe life into the street. Together, the Johnsons were ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Dinner was always around 6, eaten at the oak table that had been in Margaret's family for years. Sundays were for church, the kids squirming in pews while Margaret sang hymns in a clear soprano. Summers were for Little League games, for barbecues with neighbors, for chasing lightning bugs until the sky went dark. Their yellow house wasn't perfect. The paint peeled near the windowsills, the roof leaked when storms rolled in. But it was theirs. A home filled with small, tender details. Robert's tools lined up neatly in the garage, Margaret's cookbook stained with grease and flour, Emily's choir ribbons tacked to her bedroom wall, Tommy's baseball glove left on the porch to dry after a game. If you walked down that street in the mid-70s, you wouldn't have thought twice about them. They blended in. They weren't the wealthiest, not the poorest, just in the middle. But sometimes, those are the stories that cut the deepest. because when tragedy finds people like that, it feels like it could find anyone. The town itself was a character in this story. It wasn't a big place, more of a dot on the map, the kind of town you stopped for gas and a sandwich on your way somewhere else. Downtown was a cluster of brick buildings, a diner with red vinyl booths, a pharmacy where folks picked up gossip along with their prescriptions, a hardware store that smelled of sawdust. There was only one movie theater, showing second-run films on a single screen. The bowling alley was the closest thing to nightlife, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the dark. Kids rode their bikes everywhere, no helmets, no fear. Parents left doors unlocked, trusting that bad things happened somewhere else. The 70s were a different time. No cell phones, no internet, no 24-hour news cycle feeding anxieties. If someone didn't show up to work, you assumed car trouble, not foul play. People believed in the safety of routine, the comfort of community. And in a way, that made what happened to the Johnsons all the more horrifying, because if danger could find them here, it could find anyone, anywhere. Neighbors later said the Johnsons had no enemies, no debts they knew of, no feuds or scandals. They were the kind of people you waved to without stopping, the kind you liked but didn't pry into. But sometimes, the lives that seem the most ordinary are the ones hiding the darkest shadows. Looking back, some swore there were signs. Margaret looking more tired than usual in the weeks before, Robert keeping longer hours at the garage, Emily scribbling darker poems in her notebook, ones about silence and fear, Tommy asking offhandedly if monsters were real. At the time, nobody thought twice. They were just little things, too small to notice. Until it was too late. That's what makes the Johnsons' disappearance feel like a gut punch, because they weren't reckless or wild or involved in anything suspicious. They were a family like any other. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Because if the Johnsons could vanish, it meant the world wasn't as safe as everyone wanted to believe. Thursday, October 9th, 1975. It started like any other day. The morning air carried the bite of early autumn, crisp enough that you could see your breath while waiting for the school bus. Leaves skittered across the pavement, caught in little whirlwinds that died as quickly as they came. The Johnsons' yellow house stood calm, ordinary, nothing to hint at the darkness that was about to settle inside. Robert left for work at his usual time, thermos of black coffee in hand, his blue Chevy rumbling down the street. Margaret waved from the doorway, hair still damp from her shower, a dish towel over her shoulder. Emily and Tommy bickered over who got the last toaster pastry, their voices carrying into the yard. It was so normal, too normal, in retrospect. At the garage, Robert worked on a rusted-out Buick most of the morning, knuckles scraped raw as he loosened bolts that didn't want to budge. He joked with his coworkers about the upcoming football game, the kind of half-serious banter men share when they're tired but trying to pass the time. He clocked out a little later than usual, around 7, wiping grease from his hands as he climbed back into his Chevy. Margaret spent the day shelving books at the library, helping a young mother find picture books for her toddler. Her coworkers remembered her smile that day, the way she laughed at a misshelved copy of the Hardy Boys tucked into the romance section. Nothing about her demeanor suggested worry or fear. Emily had choir practice after school. Her best friend, Sarah, said she seemed distracted, humming to herself between songs, her gaze fixed out the window as if her mind was somewhere else. But Emily had always been a dreamer, lost in her thoughts, so Sarah brushed it off. Tommy played in a little league game that afternoon. His team lost, but he ran the bases with a grin plastered across his face anyway, arms pumping like he was flying. His coach recalled patting him on the back and saying, "Good hustle, kid," as the boy ran to his mother waiting on the bleachers. Dinner that night was meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Simple, hearty, the kind of meal that left the kitchen warm with the smell of onions and gravy. The family gathered around the table, forks scraping against plates, conversation easy and familiar. Emily chattered about choir, Tommy bragged about sliding into second base, Margaret reminded them to pick up their toys in the yard. It was a scene you could have walked in on any evening of that year, comforting, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet, it would be the last meal they ever shared. The timeline after dinner becomes hazy. A neighbor recalled seeing Robert in the driveway, cigarette glowing in the dark as he leaned against his car. Another remembered hearing the Johnsons' dog barking sometime after 10, the sound frantic, insistent. A few swore they noticed lights flicking on and off in the house much later than usual. What no one remembers is seeing the family leave. The next morning, their car was still in the driveway. Margaret's purse and Robert's wallet sat on the counter. Emily's school bag was left by the kitchen chair, her homework half finished, pencil still resting on the page. Tommy's baseball glove was on the porch, grass stains dark against the leather. Dinner plates still sat on the table, food congealed, glasses half full of milk. The beds were untouched, no blankets pulled back, no pillows indented by heads. It was as though the family had simply stood up from dinner and walked into thin air. When neighbors finally called the police, officers searched the house top to bottom. No broken windows, no doors forced open, no signs of a struggle. Everything intact, preserved in eerie stillness. The television buzzed in the living room, its glow spilling across the carpet, as though someone had been watching and simply never turned it off. The dog, frantic and thirsty, clawed at the back door until its nails bled. The smell of spoiled milk lingered in the air. It was a haunting kind of silence, the kind that seeps into your bones. Investigators couldn't make sense of it. People don't just vanish. Families don't just disappear. And yet here was a house left in pause, like a photograph trapped in time. Rumors started almost instantly. Some whispered the Johnsons had run away, though. Why would they leave their car, their clothes, their money? Others suggested foul play, though there was no evidence of forced entry, no sign of violence. One of the strangest details came from a neighbor who swore she heard the sound of a car idling outside the Johnsons' home late that night. When she peeked out her window, she thought she saw a figure moving near the side of the house, but she didn't get a clear look. And by the time she leaned closer, the engine cut off and the street was quiet again. At the time, police couldn't verify the claim. No one else admitted to hearing it. But in hindsight, that little detail would gnaw at investigators for decades. For the children's classmates, the disappearance was surreal. Desks sat empty at school. Emily's choir director announced her absence with a trembling voice, her sheet music left untouched on the piano. Tommy's teammates left his spot open on the bench, his name still written on the roster taped to the dugout wall. The Johnsons weren't just missing, they were erased. And the longer the house sat silent, the more it felt cursed. People began avoiding the block after dark. Kids dared each other to run up to the porch, but none lasted more than a few seconds before sprinting away. Parents whispered about selling their homes, though few ever did. That yellow house became a ghost on the street, a reminder that even in the safest places, the unthinkable can happen. And all anyone could do was wonder, what happened between dinner and silence? What force ripped this family out of their lives so completely? At the time, nobody knew. The answers were buried literally only a few houses away. But for now, the Johnsons' story was just beginning. At first, nobody wanted to believe it. Families don't just disappear. Not here, not in a town like this. But as the hours turned into a day, and the day into two, denial gave way to something heavier: fear. The Johnsons' yellow house became the center of attention, a magnet for whispers, prayers, and rumors. The police taped off the property, their cars parked at odd angles along the curb. Neighbors huddled on porches, clutching coffee cups, watching as officers moved in and out of the house with furrowed brows. Children were told to stay inside. Dogs barked restlessly, picking up on the unease in the air. Inside the house, investigators combed through every detail. They noted the dinner left untouched, the beds never slept in, the unfinished homework, the dog nearly starving. It didn't look like a runaway. It didn't look like a family trip gone wrong. It looked like lives interrupted. The search began with the obvious. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking the same questions over and over. Did you see anything unusual that night? Did you hear any noises? Did the Johnsons mention leaving town? Most people shook their heads. No, nothing. Just an ordinary night. But ordinary nights don't end with 4 people gone. By the weekend, flyers went up around town. Black and white photos of the Johnson family, their smiles frozen in happier times, were taped to telephone poles and pinned to corkboards at the diner and grocery store. Missing, printed in bold letters across the top. The Johnsons' relatives arrived from out of town, grief etched into their faces. Margaret's sister, Elaine, collapsed onto the front lawn when she saw the empty house, sobbing so hard the neighbors couldn't bring themselves to look away. Robert's brother paced the living room, demanding answers from detectives who had none. Reporters from nearby cities began circling, their cameras snapping, their microphones shoved into faces of neighbors who didn't know what to say. The story spread like wildfire. Entire family vanishes home, left untouched. It wasn't long before the Johnsons weren't just missing people. They were a mystery, a spectacle. The searches stretched for miles. Volunteers formed lines through fields and wooded areas, calling the families' names, their voices cracking against the silence. Dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, but the trails always went cold. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their blades chopping the autumn air as they scanned rivers and back roads. The town was combed top to bottom, abandoned barns, old wells, creek beds. But no trace was ever found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. Each night, the search parties came back empty-handed. And each night, the yellow house grew darker, its windows reflecting the flashing lights of patrol cars that never left. For the community, the panic became personal. Parents who once let their children roam until dark now kept them close. Doors were locked, sometimes even during the day. Some neighbors sat with shotguns across their laps, watching the street through parted curtains. Rumors grew. Some said the Johnsons had been taken by strangers, a burglary gone wrong. Others whispered about darker things, cult activity, government conspiracies, even alien abductions. The wilder the theory, the faster it spread, because the truth was unbearable. The town wasn't used to fear. It wasn't used to feeling unsafe. But now, the idea of something lurking in the shadows seemed impossible to shake. The police tried to maintain order, but cracks showed quickly. Some officers believed the Johnsons had left willingly. "People run off all the time," one detective told reporters, though his tone betrayed doubt. Others insisted it was foul play, though they couldn't prove it. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, no blood. It was a crime without evidence, a disappearance without a trace. And so, in the absence of facts, theories filled the void. One detail stuck with investigators. A neighbor swore she had heard a car engine idling late that night, near the Johnsons' house. She thought she saw a figure moving by the driveway, but when she blinked, it was gone. Another claimed she heard what sounded like a door slamming, though she couldn't be sure if it was the Johnsons or her own. The accounts were frustratingly vague, contradictory, impossible to pin down. And yet, they lingered, becoming part of the folklore of that night. For the Johnsons' relatives, the panic wasn't abstract. It was immediate, crushing. Elaine, Margaret's sister, refused to leave town. She slept on a neighbor's couch, clinging to the hope that any moment the phone would ring with good news. Each day she walked past the yellow house, staring at its stillness, willing the door to open, for Margaret to step out and wave like nothing had happened. Robert's brother grew angry. He cornered officers, demanding they search harder, accusing them of giving up too soon. He made late-night calls to TV stations, desperate to keep the case in the headlines. The grief wasn't soft. It was jagged, raw, the kind that left wounds no one could see. As days turned into weeks, the panic shifted. What began as frantic searching slowly became a quiet, heavy waiting. The town couldn't stay on high alert forever. People had jobs, kids, bills. But the fear never fully faded. Halloween came and went. Children trick-or-treated, but parents trailed close behind, flashlights in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. Thanksgiving passed with an empty seat at the Johnsons' extended family table. Christmas lights went up on other houses, but not the yellow one. It was still dark, still silent, frozen in time. The Johnsons were gone, and nobody knew where. And here's the cruelest part. The entire time, the answer wasn't far. It wasn't out in the woods, or across state lines, or in some distant city. It was close. Too close. Buried deep beneath the feet of the very people searching. But no one knew that yet. As weeks passed with no answers, the silence around the Johnsons' disappearance grew unbearable. In that silence, rumors took root. And like weeds, they spread fast, choking out reason and truth. People in town whispered theories in hushed voices at the grocery store, at the diner, after church on Sundays. Everyone had an idea, everyone had a story, and most of them contradicted each other. But in the absence of facts, speculation became a kind of comfort. Some said the Johnsons had run away, that Robert had gotten in over his head financially and the family skipped town before the debt collectors came knocking. But that theory collapsed quickly. Their bank accounts were untouched. Robert's paycheck was still sitting uncashed at the garage. Margaret's purse, with all her identification, money, and credit cards, was left behind in the kitchen. No one runs away without those things. Others insisted it was an abduction. The untouched house, the uneaten dinner, the unfinished homework, it all felt too sudden, too abrupt, to be anything else. But by who? The town wasn't exactly a hotbed of crime. Stranger kidnappings were almost unheard of in the area. Then came the darker theories. Some believed it was the work of a cult. The mid-70s had seen a wave of paranoia about cult activity. Newspaper stories about strange gatherings, secret rituals, and missing people fed into the fear. A few locals swore they'd seen unfamiliar vans parked near town in the weeks leading up to the Johnsons' disappearance. Others claimed they saw robed figures in the woods at night, stories that sounded more like ghost tales than facts, but they stuck anyway. Then there were the UFO rumors. It might sound absurd now, but at the time it wasn't so far-fetched. The 70s were thick with UFO hysteria, people claiming to see lights in the sky, farmers insisting cattle were being mutilated. Some locals pointed out that no evidence of struggle was found in the Johnsons' home. Maybe, they suggested, the family was simply taken, beamed up, gone. It would be easy to laugh at those theories now, but back then, people were desperate, and desperation feeds on anything that might explain the unexplainable. The police, meanwhile, chased down every lead, no matter how bizarre. A man claimed he'd given the Johnsons a ride to the bus station in a nearby town. Officers checked. The station had no record of tickets purchased, no witnesses who saw them. A woman swore she'd spotted Margaret and the kids at a diner 2 states away. Detectives drove out, showed photographs around. No one there recognized them. Psychics came forward too, as they often do in high-profile cases. One claimed the Johnsons were being held in a cabin in the woods. A search party spent hours trudging through brush and mud, only to find an abandoned hunting shack filled with empty beer cans. Another psychic insisted the family was alive but hidden underground. That one stuck in the minds of investigators more than they cared to admit, though no evidence ever surfaced. The case became a magnet for false confessions as well. A drifter was arrested several towns over and, while drunk, claimed he had killed the Johnsons. But under questioning, his story unraveled in minutes. He didn't even know how many children they had. Every time the police thought they had a lead, it collapsed into nothing. Every path ended in a dead end. And through it all, the Johnsons' house sat untouched, frozen. The plates from their last meal were eventually cleared, the dog rehomed, but the rooms remained heavy with absence. Emily's choir ribbons still hung in her room. Tommy's baseball gloves still sat on the porch. Margaret's cookbook still lined the kitchen shelves. It was as if they had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And soon, people began to move on. At least, they tried to. Neighbors still locked their doors at night, still avoided walking past the Johnsons' house if they could help it. Parents still held their children closer, but slowly, the urgency faded. The search parties dwindled, the flyers yellowed and curled at the edges, peeling from telephone poles. The Johnsons' disappearance became something different, not just a mystery, but a story, something people told in lowered voices, with that same nervous energy reserved for ghost tales. You know the Johnsons' house? They just vanished, right in the middle of dinner. It was the kind of story that kids repeated at sleepovers, daring each other to knock on the door of the empty house after dark, a local legend in the making. But for the Johnsons' relatives, the grief never dulled into folklore. For them, it was raw, a wound that wouldn't close. Margaret's sister clung to hope that they were alive somewhere, that they would call any day now. Robert's brother grew bitter, convinced the police had botched the investigation from the start. The town, though, couldn't hold on forever. Life had to go on, bills had to be paid, jobs had to be worked, children had to be raised. And so, slowly, the Johnson story slipped into the background, not forgotten, but filed away, like a photograph in a dusty drawer. But the thing about secrets is they don't stay buried forever. And in this case, the truth was closer than anyone could have imagined. Time is a strange thing in a small town. It moves quickly, for the young summers blur together, school years slip past, friendships change like the seasons. But for those waiting, time can feel like it has stopped altogether. For the Johnsons' family, the years after 1975 were a kind of limbo. No funerals, no graves, no answers, just a hollow ache where certainty should have been. Margaret's sister, Elaine, never let go of hope. She kept a light burning in her front window every night. A signal, she said, was for Margaret and the children, should they ever find their way back. Holidays passed with empty chairs at the table, but she still bought gifts for Emily and Tommy every Christmas, wrapping them carefully and storing them in boxes she couldn't bring herself to open. Robert's brother, on the other hand, hardened. He stopped talking about the Johnsons altogether, snapping at reporters who called for anniversary interviews, cursing the police for not doing more. He kept a shoebox filled with newspaper clippings about the case, articles that grew thinner and thinner with each passing year until they stopped altogether. The town itself changed, as towns do. Businesses closed, new ones opened. The diner replaced its booths. The movie theater eventually shut down. The bowling alley became a thrift store. The kids who had once dared each other to run up to the Johnsons' porch grew up, moved away, started families of their own. But the house remained. For a while, the Johnsons' relatives maintained it, mowing the lawn, patching leaks, making sure it didn't fall into disrepair. But grief is exhausting, and eventually, the effort slowed. Paint peeled, windows cracked. The swing set in the backyard rusted, its chains creaking in the wind. By the mid-'80s, the yellow house was no longer just a home. It was a relic, a place people pointed at when driving by, whispering, "That's where the family vanished." Teenagers broke in sometimes, daring each other to spend the night inside. They found nothing but dust and echoes, but they always left before morning. Some claimed they heard footsteps upstairs. Others swore they felt cold spots in the hallway. It became less about the Johnsons themselves and more about the story, the legend of the house where time had stopped. For law enforcement, the case became what they called inactive. Not closed, not solved, but shelved. New crimes demanded attention. Fresh tragedies took priority. Detectives retired, files were shuffled, evidence boxes collected dust in storage rooms. Every so often, a new tip would surface, a supposed sighting, a confession, a lead that promised resolution. Each time, investigators reopened the case briefly, only to find themselves at another dead end. It was like chasing smoke, and so the Johnsons slipped further into silence. For the community, forgetting became easier with each passing year. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children played in the street without knowing the story behind the empty house. To them, it was just another property with peeling paint and overgrown grass. But for those who had lived through 1975, the memory lingered. Some still locked their doors twice at night, still avoided walking past the yellow house. It was as though the air around it carried a weight, a reminder that the world wasn't as safe as it once seemed. The decades rolled on. Emily and Tommy would have been teenagers in the 80s, college-aged in the 90s, adults by the new millennium. Elaine sometimes imagined them that way, grown, alive somewhere, living under new names. She would sit by her window, watching the streetlights flicker on, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were out there. The not knowing was the hardest part. Death, at least, brings finality, a grave to visit, a place to mourn, but disappearance is a wound that never heals. It's a question mark carved into your life. It keeps you awake at night, whispering what-ifs into your mind until you can't tell where reality ends and imagination begins. And that's what the Johnsons became, a question mark. By the time the case reached its 30th anniversary, most people in town assumed it would never be solved. It was simply part of the town's history now, like an old scar. Something tragic that happened long ago, with no clear ending. But beneath that quiet surface, the truth still existed. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't evaporated into thin air. It was waiting, hidden in darkness, sealed behind walls, biding its time until someone stumbled across it. And when that moment finally came, more than 4 decades after the Johnsons vanished, it would shock the town in ways no one could have prepared for. It was the summer of 2020, 45 years after the Johnsons disappeared, when the first crack in the silence appeared. The old yellow house had long since passed into other hands. Over the decades, it had been bought, sold, rented, left empty, then bought again. By now, it belonged to a man named Frank Miller, a quiet, practical sort of neighbor who had lived on the same street for years. He wasn't the type to dwell on old stories. To him, the Johnsons' disappearance was tragic, yes, but also something that belonged to another time, like a faded photograph. Frank had always meant to renovate his basement. It was dark, damp, with a smell of mildew that never seemed to go away. He wanted to clear it out, maybe build a workshop down there, something useful. So, on a hot July afternoon, he began the work himself. He hauled out old boxes, swept away years of cobwebs, and started knocking down a section of wall that looked strange, thicker than the others, almost like it had been added later. The bricks were uneven, the mortar sloppy. It didn't match the rest of the basement at all. At first, Frank thought it was just shoddy workmanship from a previous owner. He grabbed his hammer and began chipping away at the bricks. The sound echoed through the basement, dull thuds breaking the heavy stillness. Then he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a sour, earthy scent that seemed to seep out from the cracks. He wrinkled his nose, trying to place it. Mold? Rot? Something else? The more he chipped, the stronger it became. It wasn't the smell of mildew anymore. It was something darker, something wrong. When the first brick gave way, a rush of stale air poured out, carrying with it a stench that made Frank gag. He dropped his hammer, stumbling back, his eyes watering. His first thought was that maybe an animal had gotten trapped behind the wall. A raccoon, a dog, something that had crawled in and never made it out. But as he shined his flashlight into the narrow gap, his stomach turned cold. Inside, there was a space, a hidden cavity. And in that space, something pale, something unmistakably human. Frank staggered upstairs and called the police. His voice shook as he told the dispatcher what he'd found, his words tumbling over each other. Within minutes, squad cars were screaming down the street, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the quiet afternoon. For the first time in decades, the Johnson Street was alive with activity. Neighbors gathered on porches, drawn by the commotion. They whispered to each other, eyes wide, hearts pounding with the old fear they thought had faded. Some said aloud what others were only thinking. Could it be the Johnsons? When investigators entered the basement, the smell hit them instantly. They donned masks, gloves, careful as they pried away more bricks. What they uncovered was chilling. Behind that crude wall was a sealed chamber, no bigger than a closet, and inside were bones. Not one, not two, but several sets, tangled together, layered in dust and rot. The sight was grotesque, but unmistakable. Human remains. Even before the forensic teams arrived, everyone knew. The truth that had eluded them for 45 years was finally staring them in the face. The Johnsons hadn't vanished into thin air. They hadn't run away, or joined a cult, or been taken by something from the sky. They had been here all along. Hidden, buried, just a few steps away from the lives of the people who had searched for them. The discovery spread like wildfire. News vans returned to the street, cameras rolling, reporters shouting questions. Were the remains identified? Was it the Johnson family? Who could have done this? Police were careful with their statements, but it didn't matter. Everyone already knew. There was no other explanation. The Johnsons had been found in the basement of the very neighborhood they had once called home. The revelation reopened wounds that had never truly closed. Margaret's sister wept when the detectives called her. She had always hoped, against reason, that the family was alive somewhere. Now she had her answer, one she never wanted, but one she had begged for all the same. Robert's brother was furious, demanding to know how it was possible no one had ever found the hidden wall in all those years. How could the house have changed hands so many times, and yet no one noticed? The town was shaken to its core. For decades, the Johnsons' disappearance had been a story, a mystery with no resolution. Now, it was something else entirely, a crime scene. The Yellow House, once just a haunted memory, was now the centerpiece of one of the darkest discoveries in the town's history. And as the remains were carefully removed, as forensic teams cataloged every scrap of evidence, one question burned hotter than all the others. Who built the wall? The day after the discovery, the quiet street was swarmed with investigators. Vans with flashing lights lined the curbs, uniformed officers redirected traffic, and neighbors craned their necks from behind curtains, trying to catch glimpses of what was happening inside the house. It wasn't just a renovation site anymore. It was a crime scene, one frozen for 45 years. The forensic team worked carefully, removing bricks one by one until the entire cavity was exposed. The smell was overwhelming, even after all these decades. Stale, acrid, clinging to every surface. Officers wore respirators as they carried out what remained of the Johnson family. The bones were fragile, discolored with age. Some still held scraps of clothing fabric stiff with decay, a faded floral pattern here, a button there. Margaret's wedding ring was still on her finger bone, tarnished but intact. That single detail confirmed what everyone already knew. It was them. The Johnsons hadn't vanished. They hadn't left town. They had been hidden, walled off, less than 20 feet from where their neighbors lived. Their lives, mowed their lawns, hosted barbecues, and raised their own families. The horror of it sank in slowly. The fact that search parties had combed the woods for weeks, that helicopters had scanned fields and rivers, that psychics had whispered about underground hideouts all the while, the Johnsons had been right here, beneath everyone's feet. The question now wasn't where they were, it was how they got there. The forensic team began reconstructing the scene. The chamber had been crudely built, a wall slapped together with bricks and mortar that didn't match the rest of the foundation. Whoever constructed it hadn't cared about aesthetics. They cared about speed, about sealing something away quickly, effectively, and permanently. Inside, the remains told a story. Robert's skull bore fractures, jagged and unmistakable. A violent blow. Margaret's ribs showed cracks, consistent with blunt force trauma. Emily's smaller bones revealed fractures too, though time had eroded the details. Tommy's remains were the most delicate, his tiny baseball glove found nearby, shriveled with age but still identifiable. It was clear, this hadn't been an accident, this was murder. The positioning of the bodies suggested haste. They hadn't been laid to rest, they had been dumped, piled into the cavity, covered by a wall, and left to rot in silence. Detectives pieced together the timeline. The family had eaten dinner. Sometime afterward, they were attacked, likely in their own home. Then, their bodies were transported next door into the basement that would become their tomb. It was a chilling thought, that whoever did this had carried the Johnsons' bodies, one by one, across a lawn, into a neighbor's house, down a set of stairs, and sealed them away. And no one saw a thing. The investigation turned back to the records, property deeds, tenant lists, ownership transfers. Who had lived in that house in 1975? Who had access to the basement? The answer was almost too obvious. Back then, the house belonged to George Sanders, a middle-aged man who had kept mostly to himself. He was described by neighbors as quiet, odd, the kind of person you waved to but didn't really know. He lived alone, worked sporadically, and had a reputation for being handy with tools. George had died years earlier, in the late 90s. Natural causes, an obituary tucked away in the local paper. At the time, he was remembered as a recluse, eccentric, but harmless. Now, he was the prime suspect. Investigators dug deeper into his past. They found complaints from neighbors about strange noises coming from his property at night. A few had mentioned a smell once, but assumed it was just a backed-up sewer line or rotting trash. There were also whispers, nothing concrete, just uneasy comments recorded in old police notes. Children had avoided his house. Dogs barked at his fence. Margaret, in the weeks before she vanished, had apparently told a friend that she didn't like George, that he gave her the creeps. Suddenly, everything fit. George Sanders had lived right next door to the Johnsons. He had the tools, the space, and, it seemed, the opportunity. But why? That question loomed larger than ever. What motive could drive a man to wipe out an entire family, parents and children, and then live for years with their remains entombed in his basement? As investigators pieced together the forensics, they began to see the outlines of an answer. It wasn't about random chance. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This had been deliberate, calculated, personal. And though George was long gone, the truth of what he had done was finally clawing its way back into the light. For years, George Sanders was just another man living on the block. A face people recognized but never really knew. A figure who slipped through the cracks of memory. He wasn't the loud one, not the friendly one, not the troublemaker. He was simply there, quiet, forgettable. And that was the danger. When the Johnsons' remains were discovered behind his basement wall, George became the focus of a posthumous investigation. Detectives tore through every detail of his life, reconstructing the man no one had really understood. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. George Sanders wasn't harmless. He was a predator hiding in plain sight. Neighbors remembered George as strange but struggled to describe exactly why. He wasn't violent, he didn't cause scenes. Instead, his oddness lived in subtler places. He rarely made eye contact, and when he did, it was lingering, uncomfortable, as though he was trying to memorize every detail of a person's face. He laughed at the wrong moments in conversation, sometimes at things that weren't jokes at all. His smile was described as off, stretched too wide or too slow, never reaching his eyes. Children instinctively kept their distance. Even before the Johnsons disappeared, kids would cross the street rather than walk past George's fence. Dogs barked relentlessly whenever he strolled by. Adults brushed it off. Every neighborhood had someone like George a little off, but not dangerous. It was easier to ignore the unease than confront it. But in hindsight, all those little moments formed a pattern. George's childhood hadn't been easy. He grew up in a house filled with shouting and silence, a father who drank too much, who disciplined with his fists, and a mother who eventually packed her bags and never returned. As a boy, George had been quiet, withdrawn. Teachers remembered him sitting alone at recess, staring at the ground, avoiding other children. He rarely turned in homework, but when he did, it was covered in strange doodles, crude sketches of houses, tools, sometimes dark figures looming in corners. He never thrived in school. By 16, he had dropped out, drifting into odd jobs that required little conversation: carpentry, plumbing, construction. He was skilled with his hands, but never stuck anywhere long. He never married, never dated seriously. At least, not that anyone knew. When asked, former acquaintances said George seemed disinterested in companionship, though others quietly admitted they thought he was too controlling, too intense, when it came to women. By the time he moved into the house next door to the Johnsons, he was already a loner. A man in his late 30s with no family, no career, no ties. The Johnsons represented everything George did not have. To George, the Johnsons weren't just neighbors, they were an obsession. Margaret, with her warm smile and friendly nature, may have been the initial draw. She always waved, always exchanged polite conversation. She baked cookies for neighborhood events, clipped coupons, hummed while gardening. To Robert, she was just being neighborly. To George, those small kindnesses may have felt like something more. Neighbors later recalled seeing George leaning on his fence, watching Margaret work in her flower beds. His eyes followed her in a way that made people uncomfortable. Margaret herself confided to her sister that George gave her the creeps, though she said it lightly, the way women often brush off their instincts to avoid sounding paranoid. But it wasn't just Margaret. George watched the children too, Emily singing on the porch swing, Tommy chasing his dog across the yard. They were noisy, lively, alive in ways George had never been. To him, they represented not only the family he didn't have, but the life he believed was denied to him. That resentment festered. Detectives believe George's obsession escalated over time. Small fantasies turned into darker thoughts. Watching wasn't enough anymore. Having what he wanted meant taking it. On the night of October 9th, 1975, George acted. Exactly what triggered him remains unclear. Perhaps Robert confronted him for watching too closely. Perhaps Margaret rebuffed in advance. Perhaps George simply decided the time had come. Whatever the spark, the fire that followed consumed an entire family. The forensic evidence suggested Robert was attacked first, likely with a blunt object. His skull bore fractures too severe to survive. Margaret's ribs were broken in a way consistent with defensive wounds, as though she had tried to fight back. Emily and Tommy's remains showed fractures as well, quick, brutal, and final. The attack was sudden, violent, but efficient. Investigators believe George may have caught them off guard in their own home, silencing them before they could raise alarm. Then came the part that still horrifies investigators. George carried the bodies one by one across the lawn into his basement. No one saw him. Maybe it was late enough that the street was asleep. Maybe neighbors dismissed noises as ordinary household sounds. Whatever the reason, George moved unseen. And in his basement, he did what only a mind consumed by darkness would consider. He built a wall. George had the skills. Years of odd construction jobs had taught him how to lay bricks, how to mix mortar. He knew how to build something solid and lasting. But the wall in his basement wasn't about craftsmanship. It was about concealment. Investigators noted how rushed it looked. The mortar was sloppy, the bricks uneven. He hadn't cared about appearances. He cared only about sealing the Johnsons away. Why not bury them in the woods? Why not dump them in a river, as so many killers do? Why keep them so close? Detectives and psychologists later speculated that for George, it wasn't just about hiding the evidence. It was about keeping the family. Entombing them within his own house meant they never left. They were his now twisted possession, masquerading as secrecy. And then George went on living. The idea is almost unbearable. George Sanders eating his dinners upstairs, watching TV, sleeping soundly while beneath his feet, the Johnson family lay bricked into silence. But that's exactly what he did. For over 20 years, until his death in the late 90s, George lived side by side with the bodies. Did he think about them? Did he hear their voices in the creak of the floorboards, in the hum of the wind? Did guilt gnaw at him, or did he feel nothing at all? No one knows. What investigators do know is that George left traces of his obsession behind. The notebook found sealed in the wall bore his handwriting. Scribbled lines, fragmented thoughts. I can hear them. They are mine. She hums at night. Whether it was guilt, madness, or both, it was proof that the Johnsons never truly left his mind. And yet, he never confessed. He never slipped. He carried the weight of the crime alone until the day he died. When George passed in 1998, his obituary was brief. It called him a quiet man who had lived on the same street for decades. No mention of family, no legacy left behind. His house was sold, his belongings dispersed. The basement wall remained untouched, its secret safe for another 22 years. To the neighbors who remembered him, George faded into obscurity. Just another eccentric man who had lived and died alone. Until Frank Miller swung his hammer into that wall in 2020 and unearthed the truth. George Sanders wasn't just eccentric. He wasn't just odd. He was a killer who had stolen an entire family and hidden them in the shadows of his own home. And though he escaped earthly justice, the truth finally clawed its way out of the bricks he laid, sealing his legacy forever. He would no longer be remembered as the quiet man next door. He would be remembered as the monster who lived among them, unnoticed, until the day his secret came tumbling down. When the news broke that the Johnsons had been found in the basement of George Sanders' old home, the town erupted. It was front-page material, not just locally, but across the country. Family missing for 45 years found next door. It was the kind of headline that felt almost unreal, like something pulled from a horror novel. For the families of Robert and Margaret, it was a complicated kind of closure. On one hand, the search was finally over. The endless questions, the torment of not knowing, the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, Emily and Tommy had grown up somewhere far away, all of it ended. They knew the truth now. But the truth was a bitter pill. They hadn't been lost. They hadn't run. They hadn't been taken by strangers or vanished into thin air. They had been murdered, hidden just a stone's throw away from their own home, and their killer had lived out his days undisturbed. Margaret's sister, Elaine, wept when investigators sat her down. She'd prayed for answers for decades, but hearing them out loud shattered her. "All these years," she whispered. "All these years they were right there." She later told reporters it felt like having the wound reopened, the grief of losing them, and the anger of knowing they had been so close, hidden behind a wall no one thought to break. Robert's brother was furious. He called the investigation in 1975 a failure, demanding to know how police could have missed something so obvious. "You searched barns and fields and rivers," he said bitterly, "but you never checked the house right next door?" His words echoed the anger of many who had lived through the search, who now felt betrayed by the authorities they once trusted. The police defended themselves, explaining that at the time, they had no reason to suspect George Sanders. He wasn't considered dangerous. There had been no evidence pointing to his home. Search warrants weren't casually handed out, not without probable cause, and in the mid-70s, forensic technology was nowhere near what it would later become. But explanations didn't erase the sting of hindsight. The community, too, struggled to make sense of it. For years, George had been just that odd neighbor. Strange, sure, but harmless. Parents had waved to him from their driveways. Some had even hired him for odd jobs. And all that time, the remains of the Johnsons had been sealed in his basement. The realization sent shivers through everyone who had known him, who had spoken to him, who had let him into their homes. Some neighbors felt guilt. They remembered moments when Margaret had seemed uneasy, times when Robert had worked late, leaving his wife and kids vulnerable. They wondered if there had been signs they missed, things they could have done. Others turned inward, shaken by the thought that evil had lived so close, hidden in plain sight, without anyone noticing. The Johnsons' old house became a makeshift memorial almost overnight. People left flowers, candles, handwritten notes. Children who had grown up hearing the legend of the vanished family now brought their own children to lay blossoms at the front steps. It was both a gesture of grief and a way of reclaiming the story no longer a mystery, but a tragedy that demanded remembrance. But justice was complicated. George Sanders had died more than 20 years earlier. He would never stand trial, never face a jury, never hear a verdict read aloud. There would be no mugshot splashed across the evening news, no shackled perp walk, no prison sentence. For many, that was the hardest part. Justice requires accountability, and without Sanders alive, the law could offer none. The best investigators could do was present the evidence, close the file, and name him for what he was, a murderer. Still, the act of naming mattered. For years, the Johnsons had been defined by their disappearance. Now, they were defined by their truth. The forensic reports, the reconstructed timeline, the testimonies from neighbors together, they gave the family back their story. And in some ways, that was its own kind of justice. In 2021, the town held a memorial service. People packed into the church where Emily once sang in the choir. Photographs of the Johnson family lined the altar, Robert with grease-stained hands, Margaret smiling in her garden, Emily holding her choir ribbons, Tommy grinning with his baseball glove. The pastor spoke of grief, of patience, of unanswered prayers finally given an answer. But the most powerful words came from Elaine. She stood at the pulpit, voice trembling, and said, "They were a family, not a headline, not a mystery, a family, and now, we finally get to mourn them properly." Her words silenced the room. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Johnsons were no longer missing. They were home. The town dedicated a plaque in their memory. It stood in the park where Tommy once played baseball, engraved with their names and the years they lived. Children who had never known them asked their parents who the Johnsons were, and the parents told the story. Not the sensational one, not the whispers of UFOs or cults, but the real one. A reminder of what had happened, and a warning never to forget. Yet, even with closure, unease remained. Because the truth was not neat. The Johnsons had been taken by a man who smiled at them from across the yard, who waved politely as he carried groceries inside. A man they probably never suspected, not even in their final moments. The knowledge that someone could hide so much darkness beneath such an ordinary exterior left scars on the community. It was a reminder that sometimes the monster isn't in the woods or lurking in alleys. Sometimes the monster lives right next door. And though the Johnson story had finally found its ending, it left behind a lingering question, one that no amount of answers could fully erase. How many other secrets are hidden behind walls we never think to break? The Johnsons were finally laid to rest in the summer of 2021. A double plot was chosen at the town cemetery, shaded by old oaks that swayed gently in the breeze. Their names, carved into fresh granite, stood as quiet testimony to lives cut short but no longer forgotten. For their surviving family, it was the end of an unbearable weight. For the community, it was a release of breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. After 45 years, the Johnsons were no longer missing. They were home. And yet, the story refused to settle into peace. Because when investigators cataloged the basement chamber, when they sifted through every scrap of fabric, every rusted button, every fragment of bone, they found something that didn't quite fit. Tucked into the wall, sealed between bricks and mortar, was a small notebook. It was badly damaged, pages crumbling, water-stained, but pieces were still legible. It wasn't Margaret's, or Robert's, or the children's. The handwriting was George Sanders'. Most of it was mundane, scattered notes about repairs he needed to make around the house, lists of groceries, crude sketches of tools. But in between, investigators found sentences that chilled them. "I can hear them sometimes. They don't sleep. She hums at night." The words were disjointed, written in shaky lines, sometimes repeated over and over like a chant. One page was filled entirely with the phrase, "They are mine, they are mine, they are mine." No one knew when he had written them. Maybe in the days after the murders, when guilt gnawed at him. Maybe years later, when the weight of what he'd done seeped into his mind. Or maybe, disturbingly, they weren't guilt at all but possession. A way of keeping the family he had stolen, convincing himself they still belonged to him. The notebook was never released to the public in full. Only fragments were mentioned in court filings when the case was officially closed. But word leaked out, as it always does, and whispers spread. Some neighbors swore that long after George died, strange things happened in that house. Lights flickered even when the power was steady. A low, humming sound could be heard at night, like someone singing faintly through the walls. A few claimed they'd seen movement in the basement windows, though no one lived there at the time. Most brushed it off as imagination, the mind playing tricks after years of rumor and fear. But for those who had lived closest to George Sanders, closest to the hidden chamber, the stories felt real, too real. Elaine, Margaret's sister, kept the notebook in a locked box after investigators released it. She said she didn't like having it but couldn't bring herself to destroy it either. "It's part of their story," she said. "Ugly, but part of it." She admitted she only opened it once, just long enough to read a few lines before closing it forever. But there was one sentence that stuck with her, one that she whispered during an interview, her eyes clouded with something between grief and fear. It read, "She was never alone." Who George meant Margaret, Emily, or something else entirely no one could say. But the words lingered, heavy and unsettling. And so, even with graves, even with names carved in stone, even with answers laid bare, the Johnsons' story refused to rest quietly. The house where George Sanders lived still stands. It has been renovated, painted, sold again. Families have moved in and out, some staying only a short time. Realtors never advertise its history, but people in town know. They always know. At night, if you walk past and listen closely, some swear you can still hear the faint sound of humming coming from the basement. A song with no words, carried on air that shouldn't be there. Maybe it's nothing. Just imagination. Just echoes of the past. Or maybe, as some in town quietly believe, secrets like the Johnsons never really stay buried.